Welcome to True Echo, where the stories you hear aren't just powerful, they echo through your soul. Today's story begins with a flat tire, and ends with a reckoning. A well-dressed black man changing his tire on a quiet street should have been uneventful. Instead, it turned into a wrongful arrest. But what the officer didn't know. The man he cuffed was one of the highest-ranking officials in the Department of Homeland Security. What happened next shook the entire town, and exposed a truth too loud to ignore. It was just supposed to be a visit. John Banks wasn't the type to make a scene. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. At 46, he'd risen through the ranks of government service with quiet resolve and unshakable discipline. He'd earned his post as a senior advisor in the Department of Homeland Security not by playing politics, but by navigating them. And on that sweltering Alabama afternoon, he wasn't there to inspect a facility or address a security threat. He was on his way to Montgomery to see his mother, her birthday, in fact. He could already hear her voice, fussing about how he didn't visit enough. He smiled to himself. Then came the pop. The rear tire on his silver Mercedes gave out with a sharp bang that rattled the frame. He steered calmly to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, sun blazing. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't the end of the world either. John had changed enough tires in his life to know how to handle it. He pulled out the jack and the spare with practiced ease, rolled up his sleeves, and crouched beside the wheel. He didn't see the patrol car at first. He was focused, hand on the jack, wrench twisting smooth and steady. But when the SUV backed up aggressively, parking just inches behind him, the air shifted. The kind of shift you feel in your spine, not your skin. The officer that stepped out, Thomas Granger, was built like a linebacker and radiated suspicion before a word was spoken. John stood up slowly, dusted his hands, and gave the kind of nod that said, "We don't need to make this more than it is." But Granger was already circling the car like it was stolen. His voice wasn't questioning. It was accusing. "What exactly are you doing here?" John's answer was simple, "Changing my tire." But Granger wasn't listening. Not really. He asked if John lived in the area, implying that he didn't belong. He made offhand comments about the car, too expensive, too clean, too out of place. When John tried to explain that he was headed to his mother's house in Montgomery, Granger's eyes narrowed. "You got ID?" he demanded, one hand hovering near his holster. John moved slowly, carefully. He'd had this conversation before. Too many times. He handed over his license. "John Banks," Granger read aloud. "Sounds made up." John said nothing. And that silence? It was taken as defiance. Granger stepped closer, invading John's space, pushing the tension tighter with each breath. "People like you don't just show up here unless they're up to something." There it was. Not even veiled. Still, John didn't raise his voice. "I followed protocol. I pulled over safely. I just need a few minutes." But Granger wasn't having it. "You're stalling," he said, jabbing a finger toward John's chest. "Acting slick. You think I can't see through that?" And when John stepped slightly to the side, his polished shoe slipping a half-inch on loose gravel, it was all Granger needed. "That's it," he shouted. "You just assaulted me." John blinked, stunned. "That's not true. I slipped." But the cuffs were already out. Click. Click. Behind his back, too tight. Deliberately too tight. The neighborhood was still silent, curtains twitching, eyes watching, but no one stepping forward. As Granger marched him to the cruiser, John didn't protest. His jaw was tight. His chest was heavy. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about every other man this had happened to, who didn't wear a suit. Who didn't have a title. Who didn't make it to the part where the truth came out. Granger didn't run his license. He didn't check the plates. He didn't even glance inside the car. Because this wasn't about a flat tire. And John Banks knew it. The ride to the county substation was like being trapped in a warped version of reality, one where calm composure was mistaken for arrogance, and cooperation was twisted into resistance. John Banks sat silently in the back of the cruiser, his wrists aching from the cuffs digging into his skin. The hard plastic seat offered no comfort, but he didn't shift. Not yet. Every movement could be interpreted. Every glance misread. The officer in the driver's seat, Thomas Granger, had stopped muttering under his breath, but John could still hear the residue of earlier insults echoing in his mind. "Smartass," Granger had said. "Clean suits don't mean you're clean." John let those words fade into background noise. He'd learned long ago not to internalize the venom others spit. What mattered now was what would come next. And he knew that this story, if it remained untold, would end like so many others, dismissed, forgotten, denied. When they pulled into the substation's lot, dusk was crawling across the sky. The American flag out front stirred gently in the wind. Inside, the air conditioning blasted too cold against John's sweat-soaked back, and the sharp flicker of fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with mechanical indifference. Granger led him in through the back, avoiding the front desk like he knew this wasn't going to hold up to scrutiny. He barked a single word, "Sit." John lowered himself onto a wooden bench beside the intake window, his posture straight, wrist still bound, but his expression unreadable. This wasn't new. The faces changed, the uniforms changed, but the script stayed the same, until someone broke it. That break came faster than either man expected. From the front desk, Officer Davis, young, black, maybe in her late 20s, looked up. Her eyes narrowed as she caught sight of John in handcuffs. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice more curious than confrontational. "Caught him loitering," Granger said with a shrug, not even bothering to keep his tone professional. "Suspicious activity. Got mouthy. Might be under something. We'll see." John didn't look at her, but he raised his voice just enough to be heard. "None of that is true." Davis looked between them. Something wasn't right. You could see it in the way her body shifted forward, more alert. "Did you run his ID?" "I will," Granger grunted. "After I process him." "You didn't run it?" she asked again, more firmly this time. Granger snapped. "Do I tell you how to do your damn job, Davis?" The station went quiet. Davis didn't respond. She simply turned away, lips tight. But her eyes lingered on John. Moments later, a door slammed open. "Granger," a voice called out, flat, sharp, authoritative. "In my office. Now." The temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't a request. Granger started to bluster, "I'm in the middle of." "I said now." Chief Rosa Valentine stepped into view. She was a tall woman in her early 50s, every inch of her uniform pressed to perfection. Her hair was tightly pinned back, her badge gleamed, and her gaze could slice through steel. She'd commanded precincts in bigger cities. She didn't suffer fools, and she didn't tolerate injustice. Not on her watch. She took one look at John. The cuffs. The suit. The steady, calm eyes. Then she turned to Granger. "Keys. Now." Granger hesitated. "Unless you'd like insubordination added to the list of what I'm writing up today." He dropped the keys into her palm like a child surrendering a stolen toy. Rosa knelt slightly, unlocked the cuffs, and watched as John flexed his wrists, no dramatics, just quiet dignity. "Sir," she said softly, "do you need medical attention?" John shook his head. "No. But thank you." Then she turned. Her voice sharpened like the crack of a whip. "Explain to me," she said to Granger, "how a senior advisor from the Department of Homeland Security ends up in handcuffs without you checking a single credential." The entire station froze. Granger went pale. "He didn't tell me who he was." Rosa's fury simmered below the surface. He didn't need to. You had his ID. His credentials were in his car. You made no effort. You just assumed. I had reasonable suspicion. Granger argued, louder now, desperate. He was evasive. Wouldn't answer my questions. He gave me attitude. You cuffed a man in a tailored suit outside his own car for attitude. Rosa stepped forward. Her voice didn't rise, but the gravity behind it deepened. You're not a judge, Granger. You're not a jury. And you're certainly not immune to consequences. She looked back at John. I'm sorry, she said, quieter now. You shouldn't have been brought in at all. I'm not asking for special treatment, John replied. Just the same treatment every citizen deserves. That landed heavy. Davis was already pulling cruiser footage. Rosa demanded every frame, every second of audio. Granger tried to protest, but Rosa cut him off with a single look. You don't tell me what happened, she said. The evidence will. And when that evidence played, on the station monitor, in full view of every officer on shift, there was no question left. The tone. The threats. The baseless accusations. The shove. The lie about assault. And finally, the smug declaration, you just made my job real easy. But it had never been easy. Because this time, the man in cuffs wasn't powerless. This time, the script was about to change. When the cruiser footage ended, no one spoke. The silence inside the station was different now, heavier, more suffocating. Not the kind born from tension, but the kind that follows exposure. Officer Granger stood frozen, jaw clenched, trying to convince himself that if he just stood tall enough, if he just didn't blink, maybe he could still win this. But it was over. And everyone knew it. Chief Rosa Valentine stepped forward. Her heels echoed across the tile floor with slow, deliberate strikes, each one more damning than the last. She turned toward Granger, who refused to meet her eyes. You assaulted a man doing nothing wrong, she said coldly. You created a confrontation where there was none. And worst of all, you treated an innocent citizen as a threat based on nothing but your own bias. Granger's voice cracked beneath the pressure. I didn't know who he was. You shouldn't have to know a man's job title to treat him like a human being, Rosa snapped. You think he's the first man you've done this to? The only difference this time is you got caught on camera doing it to someone whose name happens to carry weight. But you've been walking this line for years. His lips parted again, but no words came. He was unraveling now, not because he'd been proven wrong, but because he no longer had the power to pretend he was right. John hadn't moved. He stood near the monitor, arms relaxed at his sides, eyes not triumphant, but tired. Tired in a way that spoke of years of holding it all together. Years of being, the calm one, the articulate one, the one who doesn't escalate. I don't want your apology, John said quietly. I want your accountability. Rosa turned her head toward him, her expression hardening with conviction. You're going to get that. Then she turned back to Granger. Hand over your badge and weapon. Effective immediately. You are suspended, pending full investigation. And if I have my way, she added, you'll never wear a uniform again. Granger didn't move. Rosa didn't flinch. Now. With slow, shaking hands, Granger unclipped his badge and placed it on the desk. It landed with a dull metallic sound, a sound that marked the end of a career built on the wrong kind of authority. His sidearm followed. He looked around the room like a drowning man, hoping someone, anyone, might toss him a lifeline. No one did. They all saw him now for what he truly was. Not a protector. Not a peacekeeper. Just a man who mistook fear for instinct and power for permission. John didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Granger. His gaze stayed on Rosa. I'm not asking for vengeance, he said. Just justice. For me. For every man who's ever been treated like a suspect for changing a tire. Rosa nodded. Her voice lowered, steady and clear. I want every officer in this room to understand something. This isn't about race sensitivity training. This isn't about public relations. This is about basic professionalism. About who we are when no one is watching, or when everyone is. She looked around at every officer in that room, her words ringing out like a bell across the station. This is not how we do things. Not anymore. She paused, then turned back to John. I will make this right. John exhaled, slow and steady. The cuffs were gone, but the imprint they left still throbbed beneath the skin. Not just for me, he said. Make it right for the next person. The one who doesn't wear a suit. The one who doesn't have a title. The teenager who freezes up when a cruiser pulls behind him at night because he knows that one wrong word could mean his life. He didn't shout. He didn't preach. But the words were heavier than any sermon. Rosa gave a firm nod. We start now. And in that moment, something shifted in the room. A reckoning. A quiet, undeniable understanding that justice wasn't just a legal term, it was a standard. And it had been violated. But John Banks wasn't done. Not yet. Because justice, he knew, doesn't live in the walls of a police station. It lives in policy. In people. In the stories that get told, and the ones that finally get heard. The fallout began before the ink dried on Granger's suspension papers. Within hours of the cruiser footage being pulled, the precinct's internal affairs unit had launched a formal investigation. But that wasn't the part that moved the needle. It was the phone footage, captured by a 17-year-old across the street, that lit the fire. The clip was only 38 seconds long. But that was enough. It showed a sharply dressed black man kneeling by a car. An officer looming. Raised voices. A sudden shove. Then handcuffs. The boy had been filming through a parted curtain, too afraid to intervene, but unable to look away. He uploaded it that night. By morning, it had been shared 600,000 times. A man falsely arrested for changing a tire. A badge unchecked. A truth exposed. News outlets picked it up. Local first, then national. By the third day, John Banks was a trending name, not because of his title, but because of how quietly he endured what millions could relate to. He never called a press conference. Never staged a protest. He simply let the facts speak. But facts only carry weight if they're backed by change. And John intended to make sure that change came. It began with a conversation. Back at the precinct, now under immense public pressure, Chief Rosa Valentine invited John back, not as a detainee, but as a consultant. She cleared her schedule, brought in community liaisons, and listened. John didn't want symbolic apologies. He wanted structural reform. Policies are only as strong as the people enforcing them, he said in that meeting, his voice measured. You don't fix a broken culture with more paperwork. You fix it by forcing people to look in the mirror. So they started there. John proposed a citywide initiative. Mandatory empathy-based training for every officer on duty, not just new recruits. Community ride-alongs, where officers would ride passenger with local civilians, doctors, teachers, teens, veterans, and listen instead of lecture. Civilian-led discussion circles, with residents guiding conversations around race, perception, and fear. Anonymous reporting systems, for both citizens and officers to report misconduct, without retaliation. Rosa didn't flinch. She agreed to every point. And she didn't just agree on paper. She set deadlines. She cleared budgets. She made sure it was more than lip service. By the end of the month, John Banks stood in front of a packed town hall meeting. Over 300 residents filled the room. Cameras from major networks lined the back wall. City officials, local business owners, church leaders, and teenagers packed in shoulder to shoulder. Some had signs. Some just had stories. John didn't give a rousing speech. He told the truth. I wasn't pulled over, he said into the mic. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I had a flat tire. That's it. And yet I was treated like a threat. Not because of what I did. But because of how I looked doing it. He let that breathe before continuing. I've been called, sir, in Washington boardrooms. I've been given clearance to enter some of the most secure sites in the country. But none of that mattered that day. What mattered was that I was a black man, in a nice car, in the wrong neighborhood. There wasn't a sound in the hall. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Just breathless stillness. And what scares me most, he added, is that if I didn't have the job I do, if I didn't have the voice I do, you never would have heard this story. He paused, scanning the crowd. But you're hearing it now. So the question is, what will you do with it? The hall erupted. Not in applause, but in purpose. People didn't just leave that night with a headline. They left with a mission. Within a week, Rosa had officers signed up for the first empathy training. Within a month, John had led 3 of them. He didn't do it as a politician. He did it as a man who had stood in silence for far too long, and finally decided to speak. And people listened. Because he didn't scream. Because he didn't burn bridges. Because he burned illusions. One conversation at a time. It wasn't fame that changed John Banks' life, it was responsibility. After the town hall, his inbox filled with messages. Some were from strangers who thanked him. Others were from men who had stories just like his, but without the happy ending. And then there were the silent ones, the ones he knew existed but never reached out. The ones still afraid. The ones who'd learned early on that speaking up got you punished, not protected. John read them all. He didn't respond to every message. He didn't try to become the face of a movement. But he kept showing up. Kept listening. Kept pushing. In meetings. In police trainings. In quiet moments with Rosa after the station had cleared out. What scares me most, he told her one evening, isn't the officer who gets caught. It's the one who never does. The ones who carry that same mindset into every stop, every arrest, every report, and no one questions it until it's too late. Rosa leaned back in her chair, the soft creak of leather the only sound between them. I've worn this badge a long time, she said. And I've spent just as long pretending that my presence alone was enough to fix the rot. But I can't patch a cracked wall anymore. We're tearing it down. And they did. Not in sweeping press releases. Not in flashy PR campaigns. But in discipline. In demotion letters to repeat offenders. In promotions for officers like Davis, who had the backbone to speak up when it wasn't popular. And in the quiet room where John stood every week, hosting closed-door listening sessions where officers sat across from the people they'd sworn to protect and heard the truth from their mouths. You don't have to apologize, one teenager told an officer once, voice shaking, just, stop looking at us like we're a danger every time we walk past you. It wasn't a revolution. Not yet. But it was real. One evening, John sat on the steps of his mother's house, the visit he never got to make finally taking place. The stars were out, and the summer air had cooled just enough to feel like a blessing. She brought him sweet tea, just the way he liked it, no lemon, heavy on the sugar. I saw you on the news, she said softly, sitting beside him. John gave a faint chuckle. You and half the state. I'm proud of you, she said. But I also worry. He looked at her. Why? Because when you stand this tall, baby, you make yourself a target. People don't like being shown their own reflection. John nodded. He knew it. Had lived it. But he also knew that if he stepped back, the system wouldn't fix itself. "I can take it," he told her. "I just don't want the next kid to have to." She put a hand on his. "That's what your father used to say. Every inch you gain, gain it for someone else." They sat in silence a while. And in that silence, John made another decision. It wasn't enough to change policy. He needed to change culture. Because what happened to him wasn't isolated. It was a symptom. And he had the tools, and the truth, to treat the root cause. John Banks didn't ask to become a symbol. But symbols, he'd learned, are made not by intention, but by endurance. By the end of that summer, the reforms he'd initiated had taken root far beyond the station where he was once handcuffed. Word spread across neighboring counties. Other precincts asked Chief Rosa Valentine for copies of her new training manuals. Civilian oversight boards began forming in cities where they'd never existed before. Even at the federal level, a quiet ripple started moving through the Department of Homeland Security. A few colleagues reached out discreetly, asking for his input on new bias assessment protocols. His name came up in a Senate Oversight Committee briefing, once in passing, then again with force. But none of that changed him. He still drove the same Mercedes. Still wore the same chocolate brown suit on Mondays. Still walked into every meeting with the calm of a man who knew his worth, even when the world tried to discount it. It was on a quiet Tuesday morning that the unexpected happened. He had just wrapped up a session at the precinct, this one with 3 rookies and 2 veterans, when a young officer approached him in the hallway. John recognized him instantly. He'd seen him once, the night Granger was suspended. Standing near the back of the room. Silent, wide-eyed, absorbing every word. "Sir," the young man said, hands tucked nervously into his pockets, "I've been meaning to thank you." John paused, studying him. "For what?" "For the way you handled all of it," the officer said. "I've been in training 6 months. They teach us how to de-escalate, how to enforce, how to defend ourselves. But no one ever taught us what restraint looks like. Until I saw you." John didn't smile. He simply nodded once, thoughtfully. The young man looked down. "Sometimes I wonder if I have it in me. To be the kind of officer that people trust. That doesn't make things worse just because he's scared." John placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You just did," he said. "Because you questioned yourself before the damage was done. That's where change begins. Not with punishment. But with pause." They stood there a moment longer before the officer offered a small salute and turned away. John walked out into the sunlight, the Alabama sky open and bright above him. The world outside hadn't changed. Not all of it. He still passed neighbors who locked their car doors when he walked by. Still saw headlines that told stories that mirrored his own, with different names, different endings. But something inside had shifted. Because the difference between a moment and a movement is what you do next. And John was just getting started. He began drafting a proposal for statewide reform. Not just for law enforcement, but for public-facing agencies across the board, transportation, security, education. Anywhere where power and perception collided. He called it the Mirror Initiative. The goal was simple: make every official, officer, or civil servant hold up a mirror to their own bias before they made decisions that shaped someone else's life. The proposal was bold. Some called it unrealistic. Others called it dangerous. But John knew what it really was: necessary. And behind closed doors, more people agreed than were willing to say it out loud. That was enough for him. He wasn't chasing applause. He was building something that would outlast him. A year passed. Not quietly, but purposefully. The footage of John Banks' wrongful arrest had become more than just viral content. It had become required viewing in over a dozen training academies. Chief Rosa Valentine personally ensured every new recruit in her jurisdiction watched the full tape, not the headlines, not the edits. All of it. From the moment John knelt by his car to the sound of the cuffs clicking shut. Because, as she often told them, you don't learn integrity by watching a highlight reel. You learn it by watching what happens when nobody thinks the camera is rolling. John didn't fade into the background after that year. If anything, he became harder to ignore. He had finalized the Mirror Initiative and begun presenting it to county commissioners, state boards, and eventually, a panel in Washington. Not because he wanted power, but because he already understood it. And he knew it had to be tempered with accountability, or it rotted from within. What kept him grounded wasn't the policies, though. It was the people. The janitor at the courthouse who whispered, "Thank you," as John passed by. The middle school principal who asked John to speak at a school assembly. The grandmother who approached him in the parking lot and pressed a hand to his arm, "You stood still, so the rest of us could stand up." But the moment that etched itself deepest into his heart came on a quiet morning, months after the protests died down, long after the news cycle had moved on. John was sitting at a small cafe near City Hall, sipping black coffee, reviewing notes on a speaking engagement. A boy, maybe 14, approached his table, fidgeting with the hem of his hoodie. "Excuse me," the boy said, barely audible. "You're the man from the video, right?" John looked up, offered a calm nod. "I am." The boy looked like he wanted to run, but he stayed rooted. "My brother saw what happened to you. He used to be scared every time a cop drove past us. But after watching what you did, and how you didn't fight back, how you didn't yell," he said, "maybe there's still hope." John blinked. That hit deeper than anything else had. "What's your brother's name?" he asked. "Marcus," the boy said. "He wants to be a lawyer now. Said maybe he could fix stuff, too." John reached into his briefcase and handed the boy a card. "Tell Marcus when he's ready, I'll make the call to get him an internship." The boy's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Really," John said. "We don't rise to be seen. We rise so others know they can." As the boy ran off, John leaned back in his chair. No applause. No cameras. Just a moment that mattered. Because the truth is, change doesn't always come in the form of grand gestures. Sometimes it's in the restraint not to shout when the world shouts at you. Sometimes it's in the quiet dignity of a man who holds his ground with both hands cuffed behind him. Sometimes, it's in the echo of one small act, heard in 1,000 other lives. And sometimes, a flat tire doesn't just reroute a car. It reroutes a system. This is true echo, where powerful stories don't just speak, they echo. John Banks could have screamed. He could have let anger define his story. Instead, he chose purpose. He stood in silence, not because he was weak, but because he understood something most people miss: dignity doesn't shout. It stands tall, even when the world tries to pull it down. As he said, you shouldn't have to know a man's title to treat him with respect. Let that echo. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about how we see each other, subscribe to True Echo, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this isn't just about one man. It's about all of us.